4 generations of the same family ran the restaurant with the best meat dishes in the same small town. Customers traveled for hours just to taste that special flavor. Everyone wondered about the secret recipe, but they never told anyone, until the newly hired young sous chef opened the locked door in the restaurant's basement. What he found inside would question not only that family's history, but the entire town's 80-year past. Tonight, I will tell you the story of recipes you'll never find in any cookbook. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face the darkest truths hidden in plain sight. If you dare to discover what really happens behind closed kitchen doors, hit that subscribe button. Tell us in the comments what country you're watching from. Let's uncover these buried secrets together. The Schneider family restaurant sat on the corner of Bergmann Street in the quiet German town of Rothenburg, a place where cobblestone streets whispered stories of centuries past, and tradition was valued above all else. The restaurant's weathered wooden sign, hand-carved in 1915, bore the family crest and a simple promise: tradition, since 1915. But the true tradition practiced within those walls was far darker than any customer could have imagined. In the autumn of 1995, Thomas Brennan arrived in Rothenburg with culinary dreams and an empty wallet. The 28-year-old had spent 5 years training in various restaurants across Europe, learning techniques from French masters and Italian nonnas, always searching for that perfect kitchen where his talents would finally be recognized. When he saw the job posting for a sous chef at Schneider's, he felt destiny calling. The restaurant's legendary reputation for exceptional meat dishes had reached even the prestigious culinary schools of Paris. The Schneider family had operated their establishment for exactly 80 years, passing kitchen secrets from generation to generation with the solemnity of religious ritual. Karl Schneider, the original founder, had opened the restaurant in 1915 during the darkest days of World War I, when food scarcity had forced many Germans to discover creative solutions for survival. His son Heinrich had taken over in 1945, maintaining his father's mysterious recipes through post-war recovery and economic miracles. Lucas Schneider assumed control in 1970, preserving family traditions through decades of modernization and changing tastes. Now, in 1995, Lucas's daughter Clara managed daily operations, while her aging father supervised from his apartment above the restaurant. Thomas's interview with Clara Schneider took place in the restaurant's private dining room, surrounded by photographs documenting 80 years of family history. Images showed Karl Schneider standing proudly before his new establishment, Heinrich serving customers during Reconstruction years, Lucas accepting culinary awards from regional food critics. But Thomas noticed something peculiar about these family portraits. Every generation of Schneiders shared the same unsettling intensity in their eyes, as if they possessed knowledge that set them apart from ordinary restaurateurs. Clara herself was a striking woman of 45, with sharp features and dark hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized her angular face. She moved with predatory grace that seemed more suited to hunting than hospitality, and her questions during the interview focused less on Thomas's culinary training than on his ability to maintain confidentiality and follow instructions without question. "Our family recipes are sacred," Clara explained, her voice carrying the weight of generations. "They've been perfected over 80 years, passed from father to son, mother to daughter. We don't share our methods with outsiders. If you work here, you'll be exposed to techniques that must never leave this kitchen. Can you accept that responsibility?" Thomas eagerly agreed, interpreting her words as typical restaurant secrecy about proprietary recipes rather than the sinister truth they actually concealed. He was hired immediately, with one strict condition: he was never to enter the restaurant's basement storage area without explicit permission from Clara herself. The basement, she explained, contained aging meats and fermentation processes that required precise environmental controls which unauthorized entry might disturb. His first day in Schneider's kitchen revealed culinary excellence that exceeded even Thomas's high expectations. The morning preparation was a symphony of efficiency, with 3 other cooks working under Clara's exacting supervision. But it was the meat preparation that truly amazed him. The cuts were unlike anything Thomas had seen in his European training. The marbling was extraordinarily fine. The texture suggested aging processes he couldn't identify, and the color held a unique richness that spoke of exceptional quality. "Where do you source such incredible meat?" Thomas asked Clara as she demonstrated proper slicing techniques for their signature dishes. Clara's knife paused momentarily, a barely perceptible hesitation that Thomas would only later recognize as significant. "Local suppliers," she replied smoothly. "Farmers who've worked with our family for generations. They understand our specific requirements and provide cuts you won't find in any other restaurant." The restaurant's menu was surprisingly limited for an establishment of its reputation. They offered only 6 main dishes, all centered around meat. The house specialty Schneider goulash, braised short ribs with root vegetables, pan-seared tenderloin with herb butter, slow-roasted shoulder with dumplings, grilled chops with mustard sauce, and the weekly special that changed based on available cuts. Each dish was prepared following recipes locked in Clara's private office safe, formulas that had supposedly remained unchanged since Carl Schneider's founding days. What made these dishes legendary was the extraordinary flavor that customers struggled to describe but never forgot. Food critics had written extensively about Schneider's mysterious excellence, with one Berlin newspaper declaring, "The Schneider family has discovered something primal about meat preparation, tapping into flavors that awaken ancestral memories we didn't know we possessed." That description was more accurate than any critic could have imagined. Thomas's first week passed in a blur of intensive training as he learned Schneider preparation methods that contradicted everything his classical training had taught him. Clara insisted on specific cutting angles that seemed to have no culinary purpose. She demanded particular cooking temperatures that violated food safety standards Thomas had memorized during his education. Most puzzling were the seasoning combinations that included herbs and spices Thomas couldn't identify, ingredients Clara measured from unmarked containers stored in locked cabinets. The other kitchen staff operated with robotic precision that suggested years of conditioning rather than passionate culinary artistry. They never questioned Clara's instructions, never experimented with presentations, never tasted the dishes they prepared with such mechanical efficiency. Thomas initially attributed this to German discipline and respect for tradition, but something about their blank expressions during meal preparation suggested a deeper disconnection from their work. During his second week, Thomas began noticing discrepancies in the restaurant's supply records. His responsibilities included inventory management, tracking ingredients from delivery to preparation, but the numbers refused to align in ways that made logical sense. The restaurant served approximately 100 customers daily, each ordering meat-heavy dishes that should have required massive quantities of protein. Yet, their meat deliveries from documented suppliers would have barely fed 30 customers per day. Thomas mentioned this observation to Clara during a quiet moment in the kitchen. "I'm concerned about our meat supplies," he said, showing her calculations that demonstrated the mathematical impossibility of their current sourcing matching their service volume. "Either our portion sizes are much smaller than I'm measuring, or we have additional suppliers whose deliveries I'm not tracking." Clara's response was carefully measured, her dark eyes studying Thomas with an intensity that made him unconsciously step backward. "Our family has alternative sourcing methods for premium cuts," she explained. "Private arrangements with local farmers who prefer not to deal with formal documentation. German bureaucracy, you understand. These suppliers provide directly to our basement cold storage, and we handle their payments through separate accounting." The explanation seemed plausible within the context of small-town business practices and tax minimization strategies common throughout Europe. Thomas accepted it without further question, though some instinct whispered that Clara's answer concealed more than it revealed. The basement door became an object of increasing fascination for Thomas during his third week at Schneider's. Located at the end of a narrow corridor past the main kitchen, the heavy wooden door was secured with 3 separate locks and bore a small brass plaque reading "Private Mr. Storage Only." Clara descended those stairs several times each day, always alone, always carrying empty containers and returning with precisely portioned cuts of meat wrapped in unmarked white butcher paper. Thomas's curiosity about the basement intensified when he accidentally discovered a discrepancy in Clara's daily routine. She claimed the basement temperature required constant monitoring to maintain proper aging conditions, yet Thomas noticed she never carried thermometers or adjustment tools during her descents. Instead, she always took with her a leather-bound notebook and what appeared to be surgical gloves, items that seemed oddly inappropriate for simple meat retrieval. His investigation into Schneider's history led him to Rothenburg's town library, where local archives contained newspaper clippings and historical records spanning the restaurant's 80-year operation. The early articles praised Karl Schneider's resourcefulness during World War I food shortages, noting his remarkable ability to provide meat dishes when most restaurants served only vegetables and bread. Post-war coverage focused on Heinrich Schneider's restoration of the family business, with particular emphasis on meat quality that surpassed even pre-war standards, despite ongoing rationing. But Thomas noticed something disturbing in the historical pattern. Each generation of Schneider ownership coincided with unexplained disappearances in Rothenburg and surrounding villages. The phenomenon had begun in 1915, when several transient workers vanished after seeking employment in the area. Similar disappearances marked the 1940s transition from Karl to Heinrich, the 1970s transition from Heinrich to Lucas, and even recent years under Clara's management. The missing persons were always outsiders, traveling salesmen, migrant workers, tourists who had stopped in Rothenburg for a night and never reached their intended destinations. Thomas tried to dismiss these observations as coincidental. Small towns throughout Germany had their share of unexplained disappearances, particularly during wartime chaos and economic disruption. But the mathematical precision of the pattern disturbed him. Approximately 5 to 7 people vanished each year within a 20-kilometer radius of Rothenburg, creating an 80-year total that exceeded 300 missing persons who were never found. The connection between these disappearances and Schneider's meat sourcing began forming in Thomas's mind like a photograph developing in chemical solution. The restaurant had operated continuously for 80 years. The meat quality had remained mysteriously consistent across 4 generations. The supply records never matched service volume. Clara's basement visits followed procedures more appropriate for a laboratory than a cold storage facility, and 300 people had vanished without trace from the same small region where Schneider's served legendary meat dishes that customers described as awakening ancestral memories. Thomas's growing suspicions crystallized during his 4th week, when a customer became violently ill during dinner service. The elderly man had been enjoying Schneider's goulash when he suddenly began choking, not on food but on what appeared to be a foreign object lodged in the meat. When Thomas and Clara rushed to assist, they extracted a small hard fragment that the customer insisted was a piece of tooth, a human tooth. Clara immediately apologized profusely, claiming the tooth must have belonged to one of the kitchen staff, perhaps lost during preparation and accidentally incorporated into the dish. She offered the customer a full refund, complimentary meals for a month, and a generous cash payment in exchange for his discretion about the incident. The man accepted, apparently satisfied by Clara's explanation and the substantial compensation. But Thomas had seen Clara's face during those crucial moments when the tooth was extracted. Her expression wasn't shock or horror at a hygiene failure. It was calculation, the rapid assessment of risk, and the formulation of damage control strategies. And when she had taken the tooth from the customer's hand, Thomas glimpsed what appeared to be recognition in her eyes, as if she knew exactly whose tooth it was and how it had ended up in that particular serving of goulash. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The accumulation of strange observations, unexplained discrepancies, and disturbing patterns had reached critical mass in his consciousness. He kept seeing that tooth, kept remembering Clara's calculated response, kept thinking about 300 missing people and 80 years of legendary meat dishes that defied explanation through conventional culinary methods. Around 3 in the morning, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He would enter the basement storage area, regardless of Clara's strict prohibition. He would discover the source of Schneider's meat supplies and either confirm his growing suspicions or prove them to be the paranoid delusions of an overworked chef with an overactive imagination. The next day, Thomas carefully observed Clara's basement routine, noting the times of her descents and the duration of her absences. He studied the 3 locks securing the basement door, recognizing them as standard commercial hardware that could be picked with basic tools. He prepared his justification. He would claim he needed to retrieve supplies urgently during a busy service period and couldn't wait for Clara's availability. That evening, after the dinner service ended and Clara had departed for her father's apartment upstairs, Thomas approached the forbidden door with a tension that felt like the moment before diving into dark water of unknown depth. His lockpicks made quick work of the commercial hardware, and within minutes he was standing at the top of stone stairs that descended into darkness, illuminated only by the dim light from the kitchen behind him. The basement door swung open with a creak that seemed to echo through decades of family secrets. Cool air rose from below, carrying scents that Thomas's trained nose immediately identified as wrong for a meat storage facility. This wasn't the clean, cold smell of properly aged beef or pork. This was something more complex, more organic, carrying notes that his culinary experience couldn't classify, but his primal instincts recognized with growing horror. Thomas descended the stone steps slowly, each footfall feeling like a choice that couldn't be unmade. As his eyes adjusted to the dim lighting, shapes began emerging from the basement shadows, hanging forms, work tables, specialized equipment that gleamed with recent use. And on the walls, carefully mounted and framed like beloved family photographs, were documents that would explain everything and damn everyone who had ever served or consumed a meal at Schneider's family restaurant. But the true revelation waited deeper in the basement, past the main storage area where Clara conducted her daily visits. Through a heavy curtain at the far end, Thomas could see additional light and hear sounds that didn't belong in any restaurant, a rhythmic mechanical noise, the drip of liquid, and something that might have been breathing if Thomas allowed himself to believe such an impossible thing. His hand reached for the curtain, trembling with equal parts terror and morbid curiosity. Whatever lay beyond would either validate or shatter the horrifying theory that had been forming in his mind. The theory that explained 80 years of legendary cuisine, 300 unexplained disappearances, and the special flavor that critics claimed awakened ancestral memories. Thomas pulled the curtain aside and finally understood what the Schneider family had been serving for 4 generations. The legendary reputation, the secret recipes, the meat that could never be replicated by other establishments. All of it was explained in one terrible moment of revelation that transformed Thomas's understanding of everything he thought he knew about culinary excellence and family tradition. His scream echoed through the basement and up the stone stairs, reaching the kitchen and beyond, shattering 80 years of carefully maintained secrecy with one moment of horrified discovery. The Schneider family's perfect recipe was about to be exposed, and the ingredient list would prove far more disturbing than any health inspector or food critic could have imagined. Thomas's scream died in his throat as his brain struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. The space beyond the curtain was not a simple storage room, but a meticulously organized facility that combined the precision of a surgical theater with the functionality of a professional butcher shop. But the materials being processed here were never meant to be served to unsuspecting customers in any civilized society. The room stretched approximately 30 feet in length, with stone walls that had been carefully sealed to prevent moisture and maintain consistent temperature. Industrial-grade refrigeration units hummed along the far wall, their glass doors revealing contents that made Thomas's stomach lurch with recognition and revulsion. Hanging from stainless steel hooks were cuts of meat that his trained chef's eye immediately identified as human in origin. Femurs stripped clean with professional precision, rib sections that could only have come from human torsos, and portions of musculature that matched no animal anatomy he had ever studied. But what truly shattered Thomas's remaining composure was the documentation system covering an entire wall. Photographs of individuals, each labeled with dates, weights, and detailed notes about their processing. The images showed people in various states, some alive and seemingly unaware they were being photographed, others clearly deceased, and some in intermediate stages that Thomas's mind refused to fully comprehend. Beneath each photograph was a detailed card recording what could only be described as a harvest schedule, which cuts had been taken, how they had been aged, which dishes had incorporated their flesh, and customer satisfaction ratings for meals that had contained their remains. Thomas recognized faces from his research at the town library. The traveling salesman who had disappeared in 1992. The hitchhiker last seen in 1989. The tourist couple who had vanished in 1994 after stopping in Rothenburg for dinner. All of them were documented on this wall of horror, their lives reduced to processing records and customer feedback cards. The mechanical sound Thomas had heard from outside revealed itself to be an industrial meat grinder, its gleaming surfaces recently cleaned, but still bearing microscopic traces of its terrible purpose. Beside it stood a professional-grade bandsaw, butchering knives arranged with surgical precision, and specialized tools Thomas recognized from his culinary training, but had never imagined being used on human subjects. Most horrifying of all was the aging room visible through a glass partition. Here, various cuts of human meat hung in carefully controlled conditions, each piece labeled with the victim's name, the date of processing, and detailed aging notes written in the same meticulous handwriting Thomas had seen on Clara's daily kitchen orders. The clinical precision of the operation was somehow more disturbing than chaotic violence would have been. This was systematic, refined, perfected over 80 years of family tradition. Thomas's hands shook as he examined the documentation more closely, discovering leather-bound journals that chronicled the Schneider family's true recipe for success. The earliest entries dated to 1915, written in Karl Schneider's precise German script, describing his first experiments with human flesh during World War I food shortages. Karl's notes revealed a man driven by desperate circumstances who had discovered something unexpected. Human meat, when properly prepared, possessed flavor qualities that surpassed any animal protein he had ever encountered. The texture is remarkably similar to pork. Karl had written in his first entry, but the flavor holds depths that no conventional meat can match. When aged properly, it develops umami characteristics that create an almost addictive satisfaction in those who consume it. I have discovered something terrible and wonderful, humanity's greatest culinary secret, hidden behind the ultimate taboo. The journal entries progressed through decades of refinement, each generation of Schneiders building upon their predecessors' knowledge. Heinrich Schneider had contributed extensive notes about optimal aging processes, discovering that human meat benefited from techniques similar to dry aging beef, but required different temperature and humidity controls. His entries from the 1950s revealed experiments with various marinades and preparation methods, each carefully documented with customer satisfaction scores that proved the effectiveness of his innovations. Lucas Schneider's contributions focused on selection criteria for victims and methods for avoiding detection. His journals from the 1970s and 1980s revealed a sophisticated system for identifying suitable targets, transients who wouldn't be immediately missed, tourists whose disappearances would be investigated in distant jurisdictions, and locals with troubled family relationships who might plausibly have chosen to vanish voluntarily. Lucas had perfected the art of making murder look like disappearance, creating a sustainable supply system that could operate indefinitely without arousing serious suspicion. Clara's recent entries showed the current generation's adaptations to modern challenges. She had developed relationships with corrupt officials who could manipulate missing persons investigations, established protocols for disposing of unusable remains through carefully maintained connections with regional crematoriums, and created elaborate cover stories about meat sourcing that satisfied health inspectors and curious employees alike. But most damning were the financial records Thomas discovered in a locked cabinet. The Schneider family had been extraordinarily profitable for 80 years, not despite their cannibalistic practices, but because of them. Their meat costs were virtually zero beyond the minimal expenses of victim acquisition and processing. Every dish served represented nearly pure profit, allowing them to maintain premium pricing while actually spending almost nothing on their primary ingredient. The family had accumulated substantial wealth, all built on the systematic murder and consumption of more than 300 human beings. Thomas felt his legs weakening as the full scope of the operation became clear. This wasn't the desperate cannibalism of survival situations he had read about in historical accounts. This was calculated, commercial-scale human consumption masquerading as culinary excellence, refined and perfected across 4 generations until it had become the family's normal business model. A sound from the stairs jolted Thomas from his horrified contemplation. Footsteps, deliberate and unhurried, descended toward the basement. Clara's voice called out with an odd mixture of disappointment and resignation. "Thomas, I know you're down here. I could see the picked locks from upstairs. I had hoped you would be content with surface knowledge, but your curiosity has forced a conversation I had prayed we would never need to have." Thomas's instinct was to run, but the basement had only one exit, and Clara now blocked his escape route. He pressed himself against the far wall, his mind racing through impossible options, while his body remained paralyzed by the enormity of what he had discovered. Clara appeared through the curtain, her expression showing neither anger nor fear, only a tired sadness that suggested she had lived this moment many times in her imagination. She wore her usual kitchen attire, but now Thomas saw the dark stains on her apron with new understanding, recognizing them as evidence of activities far removed from conventional food preparation. "You've seen everything," Clara stated, gesturing at the documentation surrounding them. "The journals, the processing facility, the records of our family's true tradition. I imagine you have questions, though I doubt any answers I provide will make this easier for you to accept." Thomas found his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. How could your family do this for 80 years? These were people, human beings with families, with lives, with futures you stole from them. Clara's response was delivered with the calm rationality of someone who had justified their actions through decades of practice. "My great-grandfather discovered during the First World War that survival sometimes requires choices that peacetime morality cannot accommodate. When conventional food sources were exhausted, he found an alternative that allowed his family and his customers to survive. What began as desperate necessity evolved into something far more significant, the realization that humans had denied themselves access to their own species' flesh, not because it was unsuitable for consumption, but because of arbitrary cultural taboos." She moved deeper into the room, running her hand along the processing equipment with something approaching affection. "Carl Schneider learned that properly prepared human meat is superior to any animal protein in flavor, texture, and nutritional content. But more importantly, he discovered that people who consumed it experienced satisfaction beyond simple physical nourishment. There's something primal about it, something that speaks to genetic memories buried deep in our evolutionary past. Our customers don't just enjoy our food. They crave it in ways they can't fully understand or articulate." Thomas felt bile rising in his throat as Clara continued her grotesque justification. Each generation of Schneiders refined the process, improved the techniques, expanded the knowledge. "We became the world's foremost experts in something no culinary school dares to teach. Our family created perfect recipes for the one ingredient society pretends doesn't exist as food source." "You're insane," Thomas managed to say, his voice strengthening with anger that temporarily overcame his fear. "You've murdered hundreds of people. You've been serving human flesh to customers who trusted you. This isn't culinary innovation. This is systematic serial killing masked as family business." Clara's expression hardened, her dark eyes reflecting the cold calculation that had allowed her family to maintain their horrific operation for 8 decades. "We're not insane, Thomas. We're pragmatists who recognized an opportunity that others were too bound by conventional morality to exploit. Every animal on Earth consumes other species for survival. Humans are unique in denying themselves access to their own kind, creating arbitrary rules that limit nutritional options unnecessarily." She moved toward a cabinet and withdrew what appeared to be a prepared syringe. "Our family has survived and prospered by recognizing that morality is simply agreement between people about acceptable behavior. We chose to operate outside that agreement, and the results speak for themselves: 80 years of success, wealth, and culinary reputation that others can only dream of achieving." Thomas realized with growing horror that Clara had no intention of allowing him to leave the basement with knowledge of the family's secrets. The syringe in her hand confirmed that he had transitioned from employee to potential ingredient, from chef to next entry in the Schneider family's processing records. "What's in the syringe?" Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Sedative," Clara replied calmly. "The same formula we've used for decades to ensure our ingredients remain calm during the initial processing stages. Stress hormones affect meat quality adversely, so we've learned to make the transition as peaceful as possible for everyone involved. You'll simply go to sleep, and when you wake, well, you won't wake. But your contribution to our family tradition will be appreciated by customers who will never know your name, but will praise the excellence of their meals. Thomas's military training from his youth suddenly returned, muscle memory overriding his paralyzed fear. As Clara moved to inject him, he grabbed her wrist and twisted, forcing her to drop the syringe. The glass cylinder shattered on the stone floor, its contents forming a small puddle of clear liquid that represented Thomas's would-be fate. The struggle that followed was brief but intense. Clara fought with the strength of someone protecting 80 years of family tradition, while Thomas battled for his life against a woman who had likely participated in hundreds of murders. They crashed into processing equipment, scattering knives and tools across the basement floor. Thomas managed to break free and sprint toward the stairs, his only thought focused on escape and exposure of the horrific truth he had uncovered. But Clara was faster than her 45 years suggested, tackling Thomas halfway up the stone steps. They grappled on the stairs, each fighting for advantage on the narrow passage. Thomas felt his strength waning against Clara's desperate ferocity, enhanced by the psychological pressure of knowing that failure meant not just death, but posthumous service as menu ingredients for customers who would praise the flavor while remaining ignorant of its source. A voice from the top of the stairs froze both combatants. "Clara, stop this immediately." Lucas Schneider stood in the doorway, backlit by kitchen lights, his 89 years evident in his stooped posture, but his voice still carrying the authority of a man who had commanded this operation for decades. His presence brought Clara's attack to an immediate halt, years of filial obedience, overriding even her desperate need to silence the witness to their family's crimes. "Father, he knows everything," Clara said, her voice carrying pleading notes that suggested she hoped for approval to eliminate Thomas permanently. "He's seen the facility, read the journals, discovered our methods. We cannot allow him to expose us." Lucas descended the stairs slowly, his aged eyes studying Thomas with an expression mixing regret with calculation. "No, Clara, this approach is finished. I have felt it coming for years now. The world has changed too much. Technology, communication, investigation methods have all evolved beyond our ability to continue operating as we have for 80 years. He reached the basement floor and moved to stand between Clara and Thomas, creating physical separation between predator and prey. "Your great-grandfather began this tradition during desperate times, using methods that circumstances forced upon him. Each generation has maintained it, refined it, built upon it. But traditions must evolve or die, and ours has reached its natural conclusion." Clara's face showed betrayal and confusion. "Father, what are you saying? Our family has perfected something that no one else has dared to attempt. We've created legendary reputation built on techniques that transcend conventional culinary understanding. You would throw away 80 years of success because one employee discovered our secrets." Lucas's response carried the weight of inevitable surrender. "I'm saying that some secrets cannot be kept forever, no matter how carefully we guard them. I'm saying that the cost of maintaining our tradition has always exceeded its benefits, but each generation was too invested in continuing what came before to acknowledge that truth. I'm saying that it's time for the Schneider family to accept judgment for 80 years of crimes against humanity." Thomas stood frozen, unable to process this unexpected turn in his nightmare scenario. Lucas Schneider, the third-generation practitioner of systematic cannibalism, was apparently choosing exposure over continued concealment, guilt over escape, justice over family loyalty. "Thomas," Lucas said, turning to address the horrified sous chef, "you will notify authorities about what you've discovered here. You will provide testimony that will end our family's business and likely result in imprisonment for those of us still living. This is appropriate. This is just. And this is long overdue." He moved toward the documentation wall, beginning to gather journals and records. "But before you go, before police arrive, and this place becomes crime scene, I need you to understand something about what you've found. My great-grandfather was not monster who stumbled upon evil innovation. He was desperate man trying to feed his family during impossible circumstances. What began as survival choice became habit, then tradition, then identity that consumed everything else about who we were as family." Lucas's hands trembled as he held his father's journals. Each generation inherited not just recipes and techniques, but psychological burden that made stopping impossible. We told ourselves we were entrepreneurs, innovators, culinary artists pushing boundaries, but in truth, we were simply continuing something we should have ended decades ago, perpetuating horror because acknowledging what we had become would have destroyed us. Clara had sunk to the floor, her face buried in her hands, as her father dismantled 80 years of carefully maintained family pride. We are not culinary geniuses. We are serial killers who found profitable outlet for our crimes. We are cannibalizers who convinced ourselves that breaking ultimate taboo represented sophistication rather than depravity. And we are cowards who chose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths for 4 generations. Thomas found himself in the surreal position of receiving confession from man whose family had literally served human flesh to thousands of customers over 8 decades. The weight of that realization was crushing. How many people had unknowingly consumed human remains while dining at Schneider's? How many had praised the flavor, recommended the restaurant to friends, returned again and again for dishes whose secret ingredient transformed them from mere meals into unwitting acts of cannibalism? "Go now," Lucas instructed Thomas, gesturing toward the stairs. "Call police. Tell them everything. The evidence is all here, carefully documented by family that prided itself on meticulous record-keeping. We will not resist. We will not flee. Justice delayed for 80 years should not be denied any longer." Thomas climbed the stairs on shaking legs, his mind reeling from the basement revelations and Lucas's unexpected surrender. Behind him, he could hear Clara's sobbing and Lucas's quiet voice offering what sounded like prayers in German, words seeking forgiveness for sins that transcended any conventional understanding of redemption. The restaurant kitchen looked completely normal when Thomas emerged from the basement, as if the horror below existed in separate dimension, untouched by the ordinary world of meal preparation and customer service. But Thomas knew he would never see kitchen the same way again, would never taste meat without wondering about its source, would never trust family restaurant without questioning what secrets might be hidden in their storage areas. His hands shook as he dialed the police emergency number, his voice breaking as he tried to explain what he had discovered. The operator's initial skepticism quickly transformed to urgent attention as Thomas's detailed account convinced her that this was no prank call. Within minutes, police units were dispatched to Schneider's family restaurant, beginning investigation that would shock Germany and fascinate the world with its revelation of 80 years of hidden cannibalistic enterprise. As Thomas waited for authorities to arrive, he stood in the restaurant's dining room, surrounded by photographs of satisfied customers and framed awards from culinary organizations. Each smiling face, each certificate of excellence now represented testimony to the Schneider family's terrible success. They had convinced entire town, countless visitors, and prestigious food critics that their recipes represented pinnacle of culinary achievement, when in reality they were serving the flesh of murdered victims to customers who praised the flavor without knowing its true source. The sound of approaching sirens finally broke through Thomas's shocked contemplation. In moments, the truth would be exposed, The secrets revealed, the justice system engaged with crimes that spanned nearly a century. The Schneider family's perfect recipe was about to become public knowledge, and the ingredient list would prove far more disturbing than any customer could have imagined when they savored their supposedly legendary meals. The first police units arrived at Schneider's family restaurant within 12 minutes of Thomas's call, their sirens shattering the peaceful evening quiet of Rothenburg's historic district. Chief Inspector Wolfgang Kraus led the initial response team, a 30-year veteran whose experience with murder investigations throughout Bavaria had prepared him for many horrors, but nothing could have readied him for what waited in the basement beneath the restaurant that had been a beloved community institution for 80 years. Thomas met the officers at the entrance, his pale face and trembling hands immediately conveying that this was no false alarm or exaggerated complaint. His initial statement was delivered in fragments, his trained chef's vocabulary struggling to describe atrocities that transcended culinary terminology. Basement, bodies, records. 80 years. They've been serving people. Human meat. Hundreds of victims. Inspector Kraus's skepticism lasted only until he descended those stone stairs and witnessed the facility that the Schneider family had maintained beneath their respectable business. The processing equipment, the documentation wall, the aging room with its carefully labeled cuts of human flesh. Everything Thomas had described was confirmed in horrifying detail that exceeded even the young chef's traumatized account. Lucas and Clara Schneider were found in the basement, making no attempt to flee or destroy evidence. Lucas sat calmly at a work table, his weathered hands folded atop the leather-bound journals that chronicled 4 generations of systematic cannibalism. Clara stood against the far wall, her face a mask of resignation mixed with defiance, as if she couldn't decide whether to feel shame or pride about her family's terrible legacy. "I am Lucas Schneider," the elderly man announced to the stunned officers. "This facility and all its contents represent my family's operations since 1915. We have violated laws both human and divine for 80 years. We surrender ourselves to whatever justice the state deems appropriate for our crimes." The crime scene investigation that followed would become legendary within German law enforcement circles. Forensic teams worked for 3 weeks documenting the basement facility, cataloging evidence that revealed the scope of operations that had functioned undetected for 8 decades. The documentation wall alone contained records of 347 confirmed victims, each photograph matched to missing persons reports spanning from 1915 to 1995. The leather journals provided prosecutors with detailed confessions written in the perpetrator's own hands. Karl Schneider's entries from World War I described his first experiments with human flesh during food shortages, his initial revulsion gradually transforming into fascination as he discovered the superior qualities of properly prepared human meat. Heinrich's post-war entries revealed sophisticated aging techniques and marinade formulas developed through decades of experimentation. Lucas's journals documented victim selection criteria and disposal methods refined to avoid detection in an increasingly connected world. But it was Clara's recent entries that proved most disturbing to investigators. Her notes revealed a woman who had fully embraced her family's practices without the justification of wartime desperation or inherited tradition. She had chosen to continue operations not from necessity, but from genuine belief that the Schneider family had discovered culinary truth that transcended conventional morality. Her writings displayed pride in techniques that any reasonable person would recognize as monstrous, describing victim processing with the same enthusiasm other chefs might reserve for discussing premium ingredients from exclusive suppliers. The revelation sent shockwaves through Rothenburg and beyond. News media descended on the quiet town, transforming the historic streets into a circus of reporters, camera crews, and horrified spectators trying to comprehend how systematic cannibalism could have operated undetected in the heart of modern Germany. The restaurant that had been featured in tourism guides and culinary magazines was now the subject of international headlines that screamed variations of House of Horror and the Cannibal Restaurant. For the residents of Rothenburg, the psychological impact was devastating. Many had eaten at Schneider's regularly for years, praising the exceptional meat dishes without any suspicion about their true ingredients. The realization that they had unknowingly consumed human flesh created mass trauma that would require years of therapy for hundreds of affected individuals. Some customers became physically ill upon learning the truth, their bodies rejecting the knowledge even as their minds struggled to accept it. The town's former mayor, Hermann Klein, had celebrated his 60th birthday at Schneider's just 3 months before the exposure, hosting 40 guests for a meal that everyone agreed featured the finest meat they had ever tasted. Now he faced the horrifying knowledge that he and his friends had likely consumed human flesh while toasting his milestone, that their compliments about the food had been praise for the flavor of murdered victims. How do you process something like this? Klein asked during a television interview, his face haggard with sleepless nights and psychological anguish. How do you reconcile the memory of delicious meals with the knowledge of what you were actually eating? It's not just the physical revulsion, though that's overwhelming. It's the betrayal, the violation of trust that makes you question everything you thought you knew about your community, your neighbors, your own judgment. The health implications alone created panic throughout the region. Medical experts were consulted about potential diseases that might have been transmitted through consumption of human flesh. While cannibalism itself doesn't necessarily cause illness if the meat is properly cooked, the psychological trauma of learning one had engaged in the practice created real physical symptoms in many former customers: nausea, digestive problems, and psychosomatic conditions that required extensive medical intervention. The investigation expanded to include accomplices beyond the immediate Schneider family. Police discovered that certain local officials had been paid to manipulate missing persons investigations, directing inquiries away from Rothenburg when disappearances occurred within the restaurant's hunting radius. A crematorium operator had accepted substantial payments to dispose of unusable remains without proper documentation. Several suppliers who had provided legitimate meat to the restaurant were investigated for their knowledge of the impossibly low quantities ordered relative to the restaurant's service volume. But most shocking was the discovery that several former employees had learned the truth over the years and chosen to maintain silence rather than expose operations. 2 retired kitchen staff members admitted they had suspected the Schneider family's secrets, but convinced themselves that keeping their jobs was more important than investigating uncomfortable truths. Their testimony revealed the power of willful ignorance, the human capacity to ignore evidence of atrocity when confronting it would require personal sacrifice. The trial of Lucas and Clara Schneider began 8 months after the initial discovery, in a Munich courthouse that had been secured with unprecedented security measures. International media attention was so intense that the proceedings were broadcast live, becoming a watershed moment in European criminal justice, as the world watched 2 defendants calmly admit to decades of cannibalistic murder. Lucas Schneider's testimony provided the most comprehensive account of the family's operations. At 90 years old, facing certain life imprisonment, he had nothing to lose by offering complete disclosure. His testimony walked the court through 80 years of systematic cannibalism, from his grandfather Karl's desperate first experiments during World War I to Clara's modern refinements of ancient practices. "We told ourselves many stories to justify what we did," Lucas explained from the witness stand, his voice steady despite the weight of his confession. We said it was survival during wartime. We claimed it was culinary innovation that transcended conventional morality. We argued that our victims were transients and criminals who wouldn't be missed by society. But these were lies we told ourselves to avoid confronting the simple truth. We murdered hundreds of people because we discovered their flesh made profitable ingredients, and we lacked the moral courage to stop. His testimony revealed the psychological mechanisms that had allowed 4 generations to participate in systematic atrocity. Each Schneider child had been gradually inducted into family practices, starting with small tasks in the restaurant before learning the truth about their meat sources, in carefully staged revelations designed to normalize the abnormal. By the time they fully understood what their family did, they were already complicit, already invested in maintaining operations, already trapped in a web of shared guilt that made escape seem impossible. Clara's testimony was less cooperative but more revealing of the mindset that had allowed her to embrace practices that would horrify any normal person. She displayed no remorse, instead arguing that her family had been ahead of their time, practitioners of practices that future societies might embrace once they overcame arbitrary cultural taboos about consuming human flesh. We were not monsters, Clara insisted during cross-examination, her dark eyes flashing with conviction that seemed almost evangelical. We were pioneers who recognized that protein sources are simply biological materials, that the human body is no more sacred than any other animal flesh. Society's revulsion is trained response, cultural conditioning that prevents people from accessing nutritional resources that evolution never intended us to waste. Her complete absence of guilt shocked even hardened prosecutors who had dealt with numerous murderers throughout their careers. Clara represented something beyond typical criminal psychology, someone who had been so thoroughly indoctrinated into family practices that she genuinely couldn't understand why others viewed her actions as evil rather than innovative. The trial lasted 6 weeks, during which prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of 347 confirmed murders, though the actual victim count was believed to be significantly higher. The Schneider family's meticulous record-keeping, originally intended to refine their techniques, became the primary evidence ensuring their convictions. Lucas Schneider received a life sentence without possibility of parole, though at 90 years old, justice would be measured in years rather than decades. Clara received the same sentence, her 45 years ensuring she would spend the remainder of her natural life imprisoned for crimes that would define her existence more completely than any other aspect of her identity. But legal justice was only one dimension of the reckoning that followed the Schneider exposure. The restaurant building itself became a symbol of horror that Rothenburg residents demanded be destroyed. Despite its historical significance as an 80-year-old structure, the town council voted unanimously to demolish the building and seal the basement facility that had housed such atrocity. The demolition was carried out with ceremony that resembled exorcism more than simple construction project. Religious leaders from multiple faiths offered prayers over the site, seeking to cleanse ground that had been desecrated by 8 decades of systematic murder. The basement was filled with concrete before the building above was carefully dismantled, ensuring that nothing of the facility could ever be recovered or preserved by those who might view the Schneider family as pioneers rather than criminals. The site was eventually converted into a memorial garden dedicated to the victims whose remains had been consumed by unsuspecting customers. 347 trees were planted, each bearing a plaque with a victim's name when their identity could be confirmed. For those who remained unidentified, plaques simply read "Unknown Victim of the Schneider Family," ensuring that even nameless dead would be remembered. Thomas Brennan, whose curiosity had exposed the Schneider operation, found himself unable to continue his culinary career. The association between food preparation and the horrors he had discovered in that basement proved too overwhelming to overcome. He eventually retrained as a therapist, specializing in helping trauma survivors process experiences that challenged their fundamental understanding of human nature and social trust. His testimony at the trial had been crucial, but the psychological cost was enormous. For years afterward, he experienced recurring nightmares about the basement facility, about the photographs on the wall, about the realization that he had likely tasted the Schneider family's signature dishes during his employment without recognizing their true ingredients. The knowledge that he had unwittingly participated, even briefly, in their cannibalistic enterprise haunted him, despite rational understanding that he bore no responsibility for crimes he had helped expose. The broader impact on German society was profound. The Schneider case forced uncomfortable conversations about how atrocity could hide behind respectable facades, how entire communities could be deceived by those they trusted, and how systematic evil could operate for generations without detection. Educational programs were developed to train law enforcement in recognizing signs of long-term criminal enterprises that might be concealed within legitimate businesses. Restaurant inspections throughout Germany were intensified, with particular attention to establishments that had operated for multiple generations within the same family. While no other operations remotely similar to the Schneiders were discovered, the investigation revealed numerous health code violations and questionable practices that had previously gone unnoticed, suggesting that the scandal had at least improved oversight of the food service industry. The Schneider family's victims, to the extent they could be identified, were finally given proper recognition and burial. Forensic teams worked for years matching DNA from the basement facility to missing persons cases, providing closure to families who had spent decades wondering about the fate of disappeared loved ones. The knowledge that their relatives had been murdered and consumed was horrifying, but for many families, even terrible truth was preferable to endless uncertainty. Lucas Schneider died in prison 3 years after his conviction, taking with him intimate knowledge of operations that his family had refined across 80 years. His final interview, conducted by a forensic psychologist studying criminal family systems, provided insights into how ordinary people could convince themselves to commit extraordinary evil through gradual normalization of increasing atrocity. "We didn't start as monsters," Lucas explained during that final conversation, his 93 years evident in his weakened voice, but not in the clarity of his memory. "We started as desperate people making impossible choices. Then we became habituated to practices that should have remained unthinkable, and finally we evolved into something that used sophistication and tradition to disguise fundamental depravity. The lesson, if there is one, is that evil rarely announces itself as such. It usually arrives disguised as pragmatism, innovation, or family loyalty." Clara remained imprisoned, her refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing, ensuring she would never be considered for any form of clemency. Her periodic interviews with psychologists revealed a woman who had so completely internalized her family's practices that she remained genuinely puzzled by society's rejection of what she still viewed as culinary innovation rather than criminal atrocity. The restaurant's customer base, those thousands of individuals who had dined at Schneider's over 8 decades, formed support groups to process their shared trauma. Many struggled with guilt, wondering if they should have noticed something wrong, if their praise for the food had somehow enabled operations to continue. Therapists worked extensively with these victims to help them understand that the Schneider family's sophistication in concealing their practices meant that ordinary customers could not reasonably have detected the truth. The legend of Schneider's family restaurant became a cautionary tale studied in criminology courses, psychology programs, and culinary schools. It represented the ultimate betrayal of trust, the complete perversion of hospitality, and the horrifying demonstration that systematic evil could hide behind the most respectable facades for generations if practiced with sufficient care and community trust. The town of Rothenburg slowly recovered from the scandal that had made its name internationally synonymous with cannibalistic horror. Tourism eventually returned, though the town's marketing carefully avoided any mention of its darkest chapter. The memorial garden became a site of reflection rather than ghoulish tourism, a place where visitors could contemplate humanity's capacity for both atrocity and the eventual triumph of justice. And in kitchens throughout the world, chefs who had followed the Schneider case with horrified fascination found themselves more aware of their responsibilities beyond simply preparing delicious food. They had been reminded that culinary excellence, like any human endeavor, must be grounded in ethics that respect the fundamental dignity of human life, or it becomes not art, but abomination. The Schneider family's perfect recipe had finally been exposed in its terrible completeness. The secret ingredient that had made their dishes legendary for 80 years was now public knowledge, forever marking them not as culinary innovators, but as systematic murderers who had transformed the most basic human act of sharing a meal into an unwitting participation in cannibalistic horror. Their tradition had ended, their techniques would never be replicated, and their names would be remembered only as examples of how far human beings could fall when they allowed pragmatism to overcome morality and family loyalty to replace conscience.